One key lesson when learning to tell a story is the idea of promise and payoff. In comedic stories, we might also call this the setup and the punchline. And in certain types of literature, we could call this the trope of Chekhov's gun, which essentially states that if a gun is described in Act 1 of the story, then it will go off by Act 3. The storyteller purposefully gives a description of an object or a room's contents or the way a magic system works, in order to use it later in the story for dramatic effect. If a storyteller makes a promise to their audience about something possibly happening, then there's a sense of suspense as we wait for that promise to be kept. And if we got to the end of the story without the promised payoff, then we'd be left feeling unsatisfied, because that promise was worthless. A false hope from a terrible storyteller. Likewise, if the storyteller gets to the climax of their tale and suddenly shows the audience something new that they'd never even thought was possible, then there's a sense of feeling cheated. The Deus Ex Machina syndrome, where we see the storyteller wrote themselves into a corner and needed some way out of the predicament, and so they created something totally new right then and there. But instead of going back to work on the earlier parts of their story in order to add hints of the promise for that eventual payoff, they just let the confusing new addition jar their audience out of the story. A well-known good example of promise and payoff is from The Two Towers, with Gandalf in the Siege of Helm's Deep. Before Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and the people of Rohan flee to Helm's Deep, Gandalf tells Aragorn to look to the east as the sun rises on the 5th day. That's the promise. Then later, as the battle appears to be the hero's last stand, the sun begins to rise on this 5th day. And as promised, Gandalf arrives with reinforcements in a pincer maneuver, allowing the heroes to win the battle. That's the payoff. We feel utterly satisfied because we had been promised that help would arrive at a specific time. And right on schedule, the payoff of promised help arrives. At just the right time. Promise and payoff, done beautifully. And in literary stories such as this, you kind of want to have the promise and the payoff have some time to simmer. Take too long and the audience might have forgotten about the promise, at least unless you occasionally remind them of it every so often. And if the storyteller pays off the promise too quickly, then there might not be the desired level of suspense in the audience by the time the payoff arrives. But when it comes to the recording of a story from history, there's not really that good of a narrative flow. The promise and payoff might have taken years, decades, or longer between them. But as it's being recorded, the author will usually link the promise and the payoff by putting them directly one after the other, or very close nearby. Because the purpose of telling about a promise from history is to link it thematically with the payoff. That's the difference between a literary narrative and a true historical narrative. A literary mind would say that the payoff was too close to the promise to have any dramatic effect. But the person living through the events would say that the payoff was years in the making. It just took so long. This type of historical recording of promise and payoff comes into play in our passage for the sermon in our series of the book of Samuel, found in 2 Samuel chapter 8. In the last sermon from our series, A Song of Failures and Hope, we saw the promise. Yahweh made a covenant with King David that he'd make the man's name great, build him a house, a royal dynasty. God would bring David and Israel peace from their surrounding nations, and God would be like a father to every descendant of David if they held fast to God's will. And while parts of that promise wouldn't come until the time of Jesus, about a millennium later, and we're still waiting for some of that promise, which won't happen until after Jesus returns, parts of that promise from God to David receive the payoff here in chapter 8, specifically the peace from the surrounding nations. We'll see God bless David through victorious salvation, and ultimately leave David in peace as he administers justice and righteousness as an example for all of the Davidic dynasty to follow, which includes the perfection of Jesus' reign in our lives. And we start almost immediately with God granting many victories to David against the surrounding nations. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 to 6. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Meth-Egamah out of the hand of the Philistines. And he defeated Moab, and he measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David, and brought tribute. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehov, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. And David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. I know that those verses show a whole lot of names and places. There are so many battles and details and actions that make us sit back and wonder, what just happened? So let's take these people one group at a time. Verse 1 is so important to the overarching narrative theme of the book of Samuel. Remember that the Philistines are the biggest big bad in the whole book. They represent the epitome of human evil in the world. And it's with their defeat that this section of Payoff for the Promise of Peace begins. And what I find amazingly perfect for our series as we're talking about God's chosen king bringing restoration to his humble people, is that this epitome of human evil isn't just defeated, it's humiliated. Literally, that word for subdued means to make humble. Even the epitome of human evil, the problems of this life that leave us feeling lost with nothing to help, they will be humiliated by God and his chosen king. One day, all will bow before Jesus willingly or not, the humble and the humiliated. Sure, the Philistines will show up again throughout the rest of the book, just like the problems of this life like to pop up their ugly heads time and time again. But it takes 10 more chapters, and who knows how many more years, until the Philistines reappear again after this chapter. And never again do they come back with the same weight of power that they were prior to this humiliation. Take hope, my fellow followers of Jesus, because sin, death, and the problems of this life have been humiliated by our King as he hung on that cross, and as he rose from the dead. We'll still have to deal with these enemies, but they have lost their power because he humiliated them. And then somehow I have to find a transition from this amazing truth applying to us and move over to the very harsh treatment we see in verse 2. I don't think I can, so let's just hit the shifter really quick. The next neighbor dealt with is Moab. Some might be wondering why Moab is spoken of as an enemy, considering that David is 1/8 Moabite. His great-grandmother was Ruth the Moabitess. So these people are his distant relations. And it was even on account of this relation that David left his elderly mother and father with the king of Moab back when David was still on the run from Saul. They seemed to have had good political relations before this. So why the harsh treatment? Why measure them in 3 equal and distinct segments and kill 2/3 of the people? Honestly, we don't know. Historically, the Moabites were enemies of Israel, and God had fought against them during the time of the Judges. But that's all that we know for sure. Well, that and the fact that God had promised peace to his people Israel from all their surrounding enemies. But if we look to Jewish tradition, which I will admit is far less reliable than the Spirit-inspired Word of God, we can see that the theory goes that the Moabites betrayed David's trust with taking care of his parents. This tradition says that the king of the Moabites had David's parents executed, and thus David goes to take vengeance. But we don't know that for sure. Either way, God gave David victory over the Moabites, and they sent regular tribute to Israel for the rest of David's reign. With the third group of enemies, we get a lot more detail. They take up most of the rest of this section, from verses 3 to 6a. These are the Syrians, or the Arameans. Their defeat is specifically linked to the downfall of one particularly strong king from the area, named Hadadezer. This Hadadezer was attempting to regain his former power that had gone all the way north to the Euphrates River. But when David and the Israelites, along with their god, attacked, Hadadezer lost a large chunk of his army. Included in that were a whole bunch of horses who were hamstrung by David's men. And before we call PETA on them, I'll remind us of the fact that this was the equivalent of blowing up a tank manufacturing facility. It put a big dent in the efficiency of Hadadezer's army. It was meant to put a hamper on his power. This first strike against him caused Hadadezer to call on his allies. But there was no Gandalf riding in at sunrise to help the Syrians here. No, because the Lord was with David. And the alliance of Syrian kings fell to the swords of Israel. And David left garrisons in a couple of the Syrian cities, thus proving his rise over them, and the Syrians sent regular tribute to David. We could glorify David and his military prowess. We could even consider the regular foot soldiers who worked with their king to achieve these victories. But the end of verse 6 reminds us that this is part of the payoff for the promise from the last chapter. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. It was the Lord who did it. He's the one who deserves the glory. Not David, not the army, the Lord. One interesting part about the word for gave victory in the Hebrew is that it's the word for saved or delivered. Literally, Yahweh delivered David wherever he went. God led David to confront all these enemies and then delivered him through them all. It was almost like God said to David, "Go throw yourself into trouble over there, and I will be there to save you from it." Now, while we shouldn't intentionally go throwing ourselves into trouble, because we don't have a direct command from God to do so, we do still have the same God. One who loves to save his humble people. That's what he proved with the cross and the resurrection. He wants to live up to that promise, both to David and to us, both of which accumulate in the peace bought by Jesus, but which were also shown similarly through the political peace brought to the Israelites under David's reign. Peace that also brings blessings to God's humble people. For us, it must be largely a spiritual blessing more than physical. But to David and the Israelites, the blessing definitely had to be on the physical side. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 7 to 12. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. When Toi of Hamath heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to ask him about his health and to bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehov, king of Zovah. David and his army went all loot goblin with the fallen enemy's stuff, which I can appreciate. They took the ornamented gold off of the dead Syrians and brought it to Jerusalem, along with a ton of bronze from the defeated cities. We might ask what David did with all these precious metals. These two verses don't really tell us, but with the later statements from verse 11, it's highly likely that it was dedicated to Yahweh as well. And also probable, these metals would be what David would provide his son Solomon with to build the temple. The Lord blessed David with victory and peace. And so in return, David humbly presented the spoils to his God. It was God who did the work, so it's God who deserves the spoils. That's similar to how we should react when God blesses us today. Give him back the blessings that he has given to us. And God provided blessing to David that didn't even require going to war with another king among the Syrians. This king of another region of Aram, named Toi here, but in Chronicles is referred to as Tu, felt blessed himself because of David's victory. Hadadezer had been warring against Toi as well, and David's war had released the pressure from Toi. So the Syrian king sent his son with a tribute to ask about the well-being of David. And that word translated health is shalom, peace. While well-being and health are in the realm of this word, it's interesting that shalom is brought up, considering that's what God has promised David. The surrounding peoples are beginning to recognize the peace that God is bringing to Israel. This blessed gift from Toi's son Joram was added to the spoils from the nations whom David had defeated, with the power of Yahweh behind him. Verse 12 lists out enemy after enemy that David defeated. Some we've seen in this very chapter. Others are just listed, and one that we'll see again in the next few verses. Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and Hadadezer, king of Zovah. All of this gold and silver and bronze dedicated back to God, because he gave victory to David, saved him from their hands. That's part of humility lived out before our God. We know that without him we have nothing. Anything and everything we have is a blessing from God. And so returning back to him our lives and our blessings is less than what he deserves. But still we should give it back to him. David lifted up the name of Yahweh in response to God making a name for David. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 13 and 14. And David made a name for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt. And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. I told you that we'd seen one of the nations in that list from the previous section again. And the mentioning of the Edomites in these verses isn't even the most important thing, nor the garrisons that David placed throughout their land. Rather, the beginning of verse 13 and the ending words of verse 14 are the important parts. The part from verse 13 says that David made for himself a name, and I'm sure that he'd accredit that name-making to God, since this name-making is a direct payoff to the promise from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 9, where Yahweh had told David that he'd make the earthly king have a great name. And just as God had promised, so it was paid off and fulfilled. The reason why I'm sure that David would accredit the name-making to the Lord is because of the end of verse 14, and it's the refrain of the chapter ringing for a second time. Yahweh delivered David wherever he went. The victorious deliverances were God's method of blessing his humble servant, the payoff for the promise. This is the God we serve. He pays off every promise, makes good on his word. If he truly says something directly to us, he is sure to do it. We can count on him. We won't receive the exact same type of earthly blessing as David did, but we can count on the good God who loves us and wants us to grow more holy as he is holy. We can count on him bringing us spiritual peace, justice, and righteousness. They might not come in our lifetimes, but he is sure to provide them for his humble people. God proves his ability to bring this about during the life of David, and will continue to do so through David's seed. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 15 to 18. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab the son of Zeruiah was over the army, and Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was recorder, and Zadok the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech the son of Abiathar were priests. And Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. Before we get to the good part of these few verses, I want to take a second to note one tiny detail that made even my eyebrow rise. That little detail at the end about David's sons being priests. Since David was from the tribe of Judah, his sons would have no place among the Levitical priests, such as Zadok and Ahimelech. But one of the commentaries I read pointed out that the term for priest could have an extended meaning beyond those who worked in the temple, similar to our word for minister. A person could be a minister of the gospel, such as a pastor, and another person could be a minister of defense, such as a commander over the army. Both are ministers, but have very different manners in which they perform that role. And even the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, translates the two uses of priest from verses 17 and 18 differently, essentially calling David's sons chiefs within the royal court. Now, with that out of the way, let's get to the important part of these verses. David is the forerunner of Jesus, the shadow of what Jesus truly is. Sure, David's not perfect like Jesus is, but the reign of David typifies Jesus' reign. It gives us the framework for that type of reign that Jesus has in our lives. So in verse 15 says that David administered justice and equity. Literally, we could translate that as made justice and righteousness. We can count on Jesus' reign to make the same thing in us, in our lives. His justice is pure and good, unadulterated by outside influence. We can count on it. And he brings righteousness. He leads us on paths that are right in his sight. Just as David himself wrote God does in Psalm 23, verses 3 to 4. Whether we're on the lush hilltops or in the dark valleys, it doesn't matter. If we follow Jesus there, it is right in his sight. The restoration that God's chosen king brings to his humble people is found in justice and righteousness. As we join God in his definition of what is right and wrong, as we agree with God's standard instead of our culture's, as we join our lives ever closer to the holiness of our King, Jesus, God brings restoration to his humble people in the salvation offered through his chosen king. While David was saved by God wherever he went, God saves us wherever Jesus goes. The salvation and the deliverance might look different, but it is the payoff of promise from the same God. And it's all for peace that leads us to God's justice and righteousness, his single standard for all. Look to Jesus, God's chosen king, and humble ourselves before him. God has promised us that all who call in the name of the Lord will be saved. If we humble ourselves before the cross, then his salvation will come, and it will bring us peace. Even when the troubles of this life raise their ugly heads again, we still have peace with him. And there are many other promises that God has made for we who follow Jesus. But I can tell you one thing for sure about every true promise. He'll make sure to bring about the payoff for each and every one. With our lives, God is not a terrible storyteller.